Alrighty. Good evening, everyone. Great to be back with all of you tonight to finish Sefer Nachum. So we started last week and we will finish tonight. It's only 3 prakim, not so long. Last week, just to remind ourselves kind of where we're situated. I know it sounds like we're jumping from so many different Sefer Tanakh at this point. Sefer Nachum is essentially a Sefer describing the end of Nineveh. Remember, Nineveh is the capital city of the Assyrian Empire, Ashur. They're the ones who are responsible for the exiling of the 10 tribes. They're the ones that are responsible for pillaging most of Judea, but they fail to conquer Jerusalem. Right? There's a miracle and they fail to conquer Jerusalem. And so essentially, this is all happening in the kind of the 600s. And the temple is going to be destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians. So what essentially happens is we have this Sefer, which is describing the destruction of Assyria, and the Jews are ecstatic. Right? To hear about the destruction of the enemies of our people is a nechama, hence the name Nachum, to the Jewish people. The structure, right, chapter 1, which we read last week, describes kind of in detail the destruction of Nineveh and the empire. Chapter 2 and 3, in many ways, do something very similar, right? It's a little hard to parse out what the distinct differences are between chapters 1, 2, and 3, because they're very, very similar. All essentially describe the destruction of Nineveh, almost from different perspectives. In some sense, it reminds me of like an Eicha, where you read 5 chapters, but like each chapter is in different ways describing a similar event. You have something very, very similar here in Nachum. Chapter 2 and 3 will have different focuses slightly. So chapter 2, which we'll jump into in a moment, we'll start off with a focus, a little bit more detail about what the downfall of Ashur will mean for us, the Jewish people. And then it's going to actually kind of hone back in on the city of Nineveh once again to describe in more detail the destruction, but specifically also essentially like what's going to happen once the city is destroyed. So that's going to be chapter 2. And then we'll conclude the evening with chapter 3, just to give you a sense of where we're going, with an even more detailed destruction of the city of Nineveh, right? Perhaps this is maybe one of the reasons Nachum is not necessarily on everyone's curriculum in high school. It seems very particular to Nineveh and to Ashur, but certainly within the descriptions, there's much to gain and to glean. And as we mentioned last time, Yonah saves Nineveh, and Nachum talks about its downfall. And the irony is that we're so happy that their downfall is going to take place. And yet, 20 some odd years later, what happens? The temple's destroyed, we're exiled based upon the Babylonians. So one empire falls, the next one comes up. And the Babylonians are the ones responsible for destroying Nineveh and the Assyrians, right? They conquer them. So we're so happy that the enemies of Nineveh, the Babylonians, take over, but then we're going to be left with destruction. The Sefer doesn't talk about that. For that, we have to wait until actually next Sefer, Habakkuk, which will start next week. Okay, with that brief introduction, let's jump back in to chapters 2 and 3. I'll share within the chat the source sheets if you didn't receive it already, and then we'll go forward. Any questions or thoughts based upon the prakim that maybe you saw, or specifically in chapter 2 in preparation before we jump in? Okay, great. Okay, so like we've done, we're going to read through some parts inside, some parts not. And here we go. Actually, before we do that, I just want to show you a map, which I put on the bottom here. Sorry for the scrolling, apologize. Okay, so I just want to show you this map. We talked a little bit last week, but just so we get a sense of where we are. So if you look on the map, right, so this is Yehuda, this is Judah, obviously we know, and Nineveh is all the way up here, right? This is Nineveh all the way up here. It's situated between rivers and also mountains, okay? It's what we would say, it's northern Iraq today, up here. The Babylonian Empire, which is not yet there, right, it's not yet risen to become an empire, will emerge from down south, right? You see Babylon is here, that's the capital. So they'll emerge from down here, which is also called the land of the Kasdim, the Chaldeans, and they're going to eventually conquer Nineveh. And so we're going to be very happy about the destruction, yet unbeknownst to us, they're going to then destroy Judea. And we'll talk a little bit about the kingdom of Egypt in chapter 3. Okay. So now we'll go back up to the text itself, beginning with the very opening of chapter 2. Okay, so chapter 2 opens up with a positive aspect of talking about us in Yehuda. Like now that our enemies are going to be destroyed, what happens to us? So that's essentially how it's going to open up, and essentially opens up specifically with a reference to our worship in the temple and the holidays. It's actually because of this pasuk that a number of scholars assume that maybe this has to do with a time right after the Judeans overthrew a bad king and entered a ruling of a good king, meaning a king in Judea that kept Torah mitzvot, that didn't turn towards idolatry. Because you see here the following, it says, Hine, al ha'arim raglei, essentially on the mountains will be the feet of Hashem. Again, we have this amazing anthropomorphism that the feet of God essentially walk on the mountains. And what are they doing? They're mivaser, right? Mivaser means to bring good tidings. Mashmiya shalom, there's going to be peace. Chagi Yehuda, this is where we see the importance of Judah. The Chagi, not only my holidays, but really the korbanos that were given during the time of the holidays will be brought back. Shalmi darayich, the shlamim. Kilo yosif la'avor bach blial kulo nichrat. We're not going to do anything bad anymore. We, the Judeans, are going to do good things. And I think it's interesting to note that the pasuk, the parak, opens with this positive outlook, because essentially what the prophet is telling us is if the Assyrians fall, but we don't change ourselves, then it's not very useful. Meaning the only reason the Navi cares that Ashur is going to fall is because hopefully that will instill within us the sense that God's on our side, right? So if God's on our side, so we should return, there should be a tshuva movement back to Hashem and to his Torah, right? There was, I think historically speaking, there was such movement in the modern era, right? After the 6-Day War, there was a sense of excitement and a movement back toward religion. And I think you see the same thing being prophesized in the days of Nachum, that people would turn back toward Hashem after they see the destruction of Assyria. So that's how he opens up, and we focus on Judea just for a couple of verses here. And he says the following: what's going to happen essentially to Assyria, because they have it coming to them. Allah mefitz al panayich, almost like a hammer of some sort, is gonna come down hard. Natsur mitsuran, essentially telling them, meaning the Assyrians, protect yourselves because a fight's coming towards you, even though it's they're not actually going to be able to successfully guard themselves. Chazik motnaim ametz koach ma'od. Be very prepared, God says the prophet, to Assyria. You're going to have a big battle coming. Meaning they're going to lose the battle, but essentially telling them, like, be prepared for the worst. And that's essentially what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen to them. And now we return to us, because why is a battle coming to Assyria? Because God wants us, the Jewish people, to return to God. He's going to make a message of the Assyrian Empire's downfall to show us that God's on our side. Key, because of God's destruction of Assyria, Shav Hashem et Gaon Yaakov. God will return the Gaon, the greatness of Jacob, like the greatness of Israel. Why? And this is the alliteration that we heard so beautifully last week. Ki bekakum bokikim. Because essentially it's like an alliteration here, which essentially means, it's the translation here, it's translating a poetic line. For the emptiers have emptied them out, meaning we've gotten rid of the pieces of Assyria, and we've essentially destroyed their vine branches, meaning we've destroyed their land. They're going to be destroyed, and the Gaon Yaakov and Gaon Yisrael will be returned. What does it mean that Jacob will return to be like Israel, right? Who do we normally think of Jacob and Israel as?
Same person.
So it's the same person. Yaakov is Yisrael, right? We often think of the Yehuda Yisrael distinction, right? Normally we have Yisrael in the north and Yehuda in the south. And here it's kind of odd because we have a little bit of a different metaphor here, which is that essentially Yaakov will be like Israel. So obviously if Yaakov here is Judah in the metaphor, that doesn't make so much sense, right? Because you don't want Jacob, meaning Judah, to be like Israel, because they're exiled. So it can't be that. It probably means something different. Anybody have an idea of what it could mean? So perhaps within the context, we're talking about battle, right? And who battles? Yisrael, right? Yisrael's battles the angel, right? Kisarita, you battled with Hashem, you battled with the angel, and you succeeded. So what are we saying? We want Yaakov to be like Israel because we want Yaakov to be a fighter, to raise up again and to be a fighter. And that's why within this context, it makes a lot of sense because we're talking about battle, right? So Israel here is actually a positive reference. Often Yisrael in the later Nevi'im is a negative reference to the 10 tribes, but here it actually is referring back to probably the biblical Israel, Jacob, which is this notion that he can become even better than who he actually was originally. Okay, so let's look inside here. So what happens? And this goes back to Magen Giborehu, right? The shield of your mighty men. This is going back to the Assyrians. The shield of the mighty men of Assyria. What will happen to them? Me'odam. They will become red, meaning they'll be bloodied in battle. Anshe Chayil, their valiant men. Metulaim, they will become, again, it's like another word. Here it's translated as scarlet, right? They're going to become bloodied because they're going to be defeated. Be'esh piladot, we'll come back to the word pladot in a minute. Be'esh pladot, it's translated here as essentially the chariots of fire, b'yom hachino v'habroshim harelu. Essentially, their chariots will be attacked, and essentially it's going to be a terrible fight for them. The word peled, pladot, that's you see in verse 4, I've bolded it for you. When I was reading through the text, it kind of struck me because, even though reading through text in Tanakh can sometimes be challenging, especially in Nevi'im Achronim, you usually kind of know the various words. Pladot is one of those words that appears once. It's a hapax legomenon, which means it's a little tricky to figure out what it actually means, right? So what is pladot? So it's interesting because what word is either embedded within the word pladot or similar enough? Did anyone want to take a guess? Pladot? If you like rearranging things, you might want to do that too. I'll give you a hint. He's the foreign minister of the state of Israel.
Lapid.
Lapid, thank you. So embedded within the Tanakh. Essentially, you actually have this often enough for those who lane or for those familiar with Parshios in the Torah. So you have the word keves and kesev. It can sometimes happen where there can be a flipping of the word because they're so similar for whatever reason, historically, linguistically, keves, kesev, they can kind of, so what you have here is probably that similar thing going on here where you have a word pladot, but really it could have really been lapidot, right? Because you have be'esh piladot. So it sounds like something very fiery. It's something very, very fiery going on here. And that's probably what it really means here. So I just wanted to show you that because whenever you see a word in Tanakh, and Nachum does it so many times, he has words that only appear like once in the entirety of Tanakh in Sefer Nachum. Now, either they only appear in Sefer Nachum because maybe it was used during a very specific time period, right? Just as there could be words that we use today in the 21st century that were not used 20 years ago and will not be used in 20 years from now. On the other hand, it could be that he essentially innovated and created specific words to help with certain alliterations and certain rhythms that he needed for his particular nevuah. And it kind of is clear to somebody who knows the Hebrew well enough to know that he's playing on the word ever so slightly. So he does that in quite a number of places. So we're actually going to see something very similar in just a moment. Look at the next verse. Bachutzot yithololu, the chariots are rechav, right? Yitolu harechav, the chariots are going crazy, yithololu, in the streets. And what are they doing? I bolded it for you again. I don't know if anybody saw this word and was a little confused. Yishtak shikun. Yishtak shikun. They're doing something called Yishtak shikun in the streets. And what do they look like? Again, marihin kilapidim. There we go, the word lapid. Chaburakim yorotzetsu. They're like fire going back and forth, back and forth. What is Yishtak shikun? Again, it sounds like shakshuka. Right? What is Yishtak shikun? So it probably is similar because it's a parallel sentence here, right? Right? In the streets, they will go mad, their chariots. And Yishtach Shekun, Barachovot, in the streets, the chariots will also do something. So Yishtach Shekun is probably a parallel to the word Yitolalu, which means like something like they're going a little bit wild. The chariots, meaning there's a crazy battle. The chariots are just going everywhere. Listen to the word Yishtach Shekun. If you've ever heard like a horse walking with, the thumping. So Yishtach Shekun is probably supposed to be a play on what it sounds like to hear chariots and movement. Yishtach Shekun. It's like almost like a train or at least a chariot moving, and the wheels and the hoofs. You can hear it in the word Yishtach Shekun. So I think it's just an interesting thing to note in the way that the Hebrew plays out here. Okay. The next couple of verses will explain some of it outside, but essentially what we see here is a switch. We've been talking about Assyria, Nineveh, its destruction, the battle that's going to take place here. But now what you'll notice here in the very first word of verse 6, the word Yiskor, Yiskor. He will think. He thinks. Who's he? We were talking about the people of Nineveh. Who is Yiskor? The Mefarshim note we're probably switching now from talking about Nineveh writ large to the king of Nineveh. Because whenever you talk about the downfall of an empire, it's important to also talk about the downfall of their king, because the king is often seen as a deity. We saw this in other Nevi'im as well. They focus on the kings. It's probably a reference to the king of Assyria. Yizkur adirav yikashlu. He thinks himself worthy. They're going to yikashlu. They're going to fall down bahalichatam when they're walking. Yamaru chomatavu chanusech. Everything's going to be destroyed. He thinks he's going to be prepared. He's not actually prepared at all for what's about to take place. And look in verse 7. This describes the palace of Assyria. Look in verse 7. Sha'arei haneharot. The gates of the rivers are open, niftechu v'hahechal namo, and the palace is dissolved. What do you think he's describing here? The rivers of the palace. Anybody have an idea here? What are rivers of a palace? Anybody ever been to a castle?
The moat.
The moats, exactly. Palaces, both in medieval Europe and also in ancient times, often would have massive ditches around them, which sometimes would have water in them. If they needed to fill it, often they filled it in times of battle or just so people couldn't cross easily and they would drown. And so essentially, it's going to open up, it's going to then perhaps even overflow, and it's going to flood the place. And the palace, which is made of like brick and mortar, is going to dissolve, right? So it's almost like a sandcastle, essentially is what he's describing. This utter destruction based upon the original intention, which was to defend the palace, it will be its downfall. And that's why he says specifically in verse 8, I'm going to read it in the literal sense, not the way it's translated, and we'll get back to the translation. V'hutzav gulta ho'alata. You hear the hutzav, gulta, ho'alata. It sounds like very similar. Hu, gu, and ho is the word here. V'hutzav gulta ho'alta. So what does that mean? So the pshat seems to be something to do with the fact that the city is being uncovered, meaning like the nakedness of the city, like its inner jewels, the palace, which is like the center, is being ravaged, right? That's probably pshat, essentially what it means. Because hutzav can sometimes mean like nitzav, to stand up. So it's like that which normally is supposed to be its center is like opened up, gulta, it's like revealed. Look at the translation. How does it translate? The queen. Now, did anybody see the word malka in verse 8? I did not. Anyone see that? What is hutzav? The queen? So this is interesting. Again, I got this particular translation from a website. It's called Ala Torah. I think they use maybe the JPS translation. I'm not positive. I didn't check some of the more modern scholarly approaches to the translation, but I'm going to guess they don't translate it that way. Classical mefarshim assume, what is hutzav? Hutzav was the name of the Assyrian queen. And the reason they assume it's her name is because the verse talks about revealing, right? We just saw him, Yizkor, we're talking about the king. And now we're talking about essentially revealing the beauty essentially of the city, which must be a reference to its queen. So the Ibn Ezra, for example, the Abarbanel, assume that the name of the queen was Hutsav. It seems to be that one of the earliest mefarshim to say that this is the queen was actually Shmuel Hanagid, which I think is quite fascinating. We don't hear his name quite often. He's very early medieval Spain. He was quite involved in the leadership of Spain itself and certainly the Jewish community. He was very well acquainted with royalty and palaces and whatnot. And he assumes that her name was Hutsav, perhaps based upon things, manuscripts, access that he had to perhaps documents that we no longer have access to, that he had access to. And essentially he assumes that it was the name. Others say not so fast. Literally, it means what I just told you before. Maybe it's like talking about the capital city. Ibn Kaspi, another early medieval commentator, says Nachum would never have recorded the name of an evil queen. He didn't record the name of the king. So why would you think he'd record the name of the queen? It seems odd that they should record in the book the name of a queen when they don't even record the name of the king. So the jury's still out on this one, if it's the queen or it's the city itself. But I wanted you to be aware of this kind of fascinating section within the pasuk itself. Okay, look at the beginning of verse 9. I've bolded for you. Also, by the way, in just verse 8, right? If you look at the rest of the pasuk, it talks about like the human body. So it sounds like it's either talking about a person herself or it's talking just metaphorically about the city. Okay, but then verse 9 says the following, and this is again the palace, which is just the descriptions are so interesting. The Nineveh, right? The city of Nineveh is what? Kivrechat mayim, will become like a pool, like a swimming pool, essentially. Meimehi vehemanasim imdu amodu ve'in mefana. What's going to happen? Ve'in mafna. What's going to happen to the city itself? It's going to become like a pool of water, and people will try to flee. And yet the soldiers, it sounds like, are saying, the soldiers are fleeing, but the enemies are telling them, Amod, stop. And what's going to happen? The enemy says, stop, but they keep running. They don't look back, right? The city of Nineveh is being destroyed. The Assyrian army is fleeing. The enemies who are taking over the city are telling the enemies, stop, we want to capture you. Keep running and running and running. But what's interesting is it becomes, again, Vrechas Mayim. They're describing, essentially, something catastrophic is going to happen to the city, which essentially makes it overflow. We already saw this by the palace, that the water is going to destroy the palace. And remember, Nineveh is situated between two rivers. So perhaps what they're describing, and earlier when they described the moats, there's also seemingly an allusion to the fact that there were multiple dams set up along the city of Nineveh. And if you're an enemy, what do you do to take the city? One of the things that they did, exactly, you destroy the moat, the dams, right, to flood the city. And so essentially one of the ways in which they took the city was they flooded it. And also remember Nineveh, you may remember this from when we learned Sefer Yonah, Nineveh in Assyrian means the city of the fish, which is the irony of Sefer Yonah. And why is it called the city of the fish? It's not on the Mediterranean. It's because it was situated on two major rivers. So clearly it was a major place where there was fishing and there was ports and whatnot. So essentially it's situated here, and they use the water to their advantage to take the city of Nineveh. And Nineveh is going to be destroyed, and that's why the capital is not going to be Nineveh anymore. Right? The capital for the Babylonian Empire is going to be, Babel. Okay, finishing up chapter 2. Just a few more pieces I want to point out to you. Essentially, I want to show you this one alliteration here, which is a beautiful one on verse 11. Right, so verse 10, they're taking all the gold and silver essentially of the city. Verse 11, buka umavuka umavulaka. Right, that's one more tongue twister for you. Buka umavuka umavulaka. Again, it somehow means emptiness, void, where we're going to essentially empty out the city of Nineveh, and it will essentially be considered nothing. It's going to be a nothing city, and that's what happens in the city, and everyone in the city will be farur. Farur essentially means darkness. It sounds like the people of Nineveh are mourning, right? They've dressed in black, they're mourning, their city has been destroyed. In verse 12, this is an image which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. If anybody, there's many museums around the world which have these massive, some of them are from Babylonia, but some of them are from Assyria, these massive lions, right? They're often blue, that adorned entryways to various palaces in the Middle East during the 3,000 years ago. And so one of the symbols of ancient Assyria, as it was eventually also Babylonia, were lions, just as we also have Yehuda and a lion, but because lion is fierce, and lions, while are not so much found today, were quite prevalent in the region. So you see the place is called, what is Assyria called, the city of Nineveh? It's called Me'on Arayot. It's like the house of lions. Again, it's because lion was symbolic, but also lion here can mean like fierce, ravaging. Aye Ma'on Arayot, where is the lion? Where are the homes of the lions? Umir'ehu lakfirim, the place where the kfirim, the young lions, used to be, meaning because it's destroyed. Halach Aryeh, the lion left. Lavi, another word for lion, for those who know, like for example, Camp Lavi. Shamgur Aryeh ve'ein macharid. How many different words for lion did we just use in one pasuk? Like anybody? We just used the word Aryeh, Kfir, Lavi. There's actually, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 5 different words in the Hebrew language for lion. And so we get, not bad, three of them right here in pasuk 12. Okay, and verse 13 essentially says, why are they not there anymore? Because they've been attacked and destroyed by a greater enemy. And we'll just conclude chapter 2 with essentially the conclusion, which is that you're going to be destroyed, certainly by an enemy, the Babylonians. But who is really destroying you? Hashem. At the end of God. Hineni elayich ne'um Hashem. This Hashem tzvakot. Why are we saying tzvakot here? Because it's the God, it's our Hashem. Tzvaot is military, is battle. What are we going to do? We're going to destroy the city and take the kfirayich, take your lions, meaning take you. Velo yishama od kol, the voice of malachecha will not be heard. Malachecha, strange word. Sounds like the word malach, and it is, right? The messengers. It's a very odd formulation of the word malach. It's an irregular form of the particular verb, of the perfect of the noun. But essentially, that's how it's used here in a certain poetic way. Normally, we don't have 2 kafs here, right? We would say malach, but because it wants to get the extra hey in for part of the poetic rhyme here, malachecha is the way that it's used in chapter 2. So just as a brief summary, chapter 2 essentially focuses on the real destruction of Assyria. It's being destroyed because we want to bring the Gaon back to Judah. And they go into great detail as to the destruction. And that's essentially what chapter 2 is all about. And we get to see kind of the beauty of how Nachum is able to compose chapter 2. Any thoughts, comments, questions on chapter 2?
How does the destruction of Usher bring back Judah?
Yeah, so we don't have an explicit answer, but it would seem that from a theological perspective, when Judah sees Assyria fall, it is a sign that God is intervening on behalf of Judah, right? So that the salvation, and that's how chapter 1 opened up, salvation of Judah kind of by default means that people will see God back in their own lives. Because remember, Assyria is all throughout Judea at this time. They don't get to go to Jerusalem. We're able to fight them off, or we get help from others to fight off the Assyrian Empire from parts of Judea and Jerusalem. But they're still like the major empire who destroyed the 10 northern tribes.
Is it connected to Parak Aleph, which is talking basically about Nakama as opposed to salvation?
Yeah, so I would say chapter 1, it's a good point to point out here that chapter 1 seems to focus more on Nechama, which is that the destruction of Assyria brings us like this this good feeling that things are better, like the enemies of our people have been destroyed. But perhaps chapter 2 takes it to the next level, right? Which is not only that they've been destroyed and it brings us nechama, but that there's then going to be that next step where we're going to go from Gaon Yaakov to Gaon Yisrael, right? I think similar to what I said earlier with Eicha, like different chapters mean different things. Chapter 2 builds upon what we've established in chapter 1, and now we're going to get even greater appreciation, salvation in chapter 2.
Are the chapters based upon the Masorah, or were they added later, the division of the chapters?
Oh, so the division of the chapters, like in many almost all, are not chapter divisions that were made by our Masorah, right? We have a Sefer, we have essentially opening and closing, different things in the text itself, which are historically part of our tradition. But the official, like chapter 1, verse 1, is not part of the Masorah. However, often, and we can look specifically in the text to see if this is the case, often they do align thematically with how we would have, like if you were to ask me to split it into 3, like I would split it that particular way. Not always, right? Famously, there are many examples where Christians focused on the breakdowns differently for specific reasons. But I think chapter 1 and 2 is an okay description because they are, in a sense, separate. However, the last like 3 verses of chapter 1 kind of flow into chapter 2.
Do you see any similarities or differences in the description of previous Nevi'im about the destruction of Israel, the destruction of Yerushalayim, and how they describe the destruction of Usher, specifically that while the country seems to be destroyed, there's no exile. They get to keep their country as a compared to all the prophecies of Israel, where there is an exile, they actually even lose the country. So how do you compare the 2 descriptions of the destruction?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I would say, yeah, we don't exactly get an exile description in this particular chapter. I would say perhaps there's a different focus, right? When it comes to Jews, the focus is that we're a people, we're an ethnicity with a religion. And so when we're exiled away from our land, like that means something. It sounds like there's more of a focus on like the loss of political autonomy when it comes to Nineveh and Assyria. But at the end of the day, if you're a village Assyrian living in a suburb outside of Nineveh, like you could still be living there under the Babylonians, right? There's a change and maybe you'll focus on their gods and not your gods. But at least from our prophet perspective, they're not interested in that. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. Maybe historically they did exile them. We know that the Assyrians did that to many people, and I'm sure the Babylonians did as well, certainly from the major capital. But I would say that exile is certainly not a focus because, again, I don't think Micha's interested in that piece. I think Micha's much more interested in the devastation that the city will see. But I will say that the devastation is described slightly differently. Here we actually have a very large focus. The city is being flooded, right? You don't get that imagery with Yerushalayim for obvious reasons, right? Yerushalayim is not exactly a place of water, right? So you don't have that description. Yerushalayim is described as being burned. And we have a little bit of that here with the chariots, but the major focus here seems to be on immense floods. I think that just has to do with the reality on the ground. Okay. All right, so let's switch gears to chapter 3. Chapter 3, as we said before, destruction once more. However, like I said, each chapter is going to be slightly different. So chapter 3, just to give you a little bit of an understanding of what we're going to do here, chapter 3 will focus a little bit more on very raw imagery of death and human bodies, both in terms of human bodies being destroyed, but also going similar, I guess let's go back to Yossi's question, going back to the classic metaphor that we have by Israel about Israel being a harlot. So we see the harlot imagery appearing here with Ashur. And we then take a little bit of a detour to talk about Egypt, and we'll explain why when we get there. And then essentially return to the destruction of Ashur once more. So again, destruction is the focus. However, it's going to take a little bit of a different angle. If chapter 2 was more about the infrastructure, the buildings, the city, chapter 3, which again, I think is going in this escalation of destruction, will focus on human lives, right? And that I think is apparent in chapter 3. Okay, it already opens up differently. Hoy, whoa. Ir Damim, the city of blood. Again, this is getting very real. Kula kachash perek mlea lo yamish taref. It's a city full of lies, and the prey, meaning the tarif, the ones who want to destroy, are not leaving. Meaning the people are coming to kill the Assyrians, right? The Babylonians, the people are going to kill the Assyrians are coming. But also, it's perhaps also a description of the terrible people who lived in Assyria, right? The city of Damim, meaning the people who live in Assyria, in Nineveh, are murderers, but also the city becomes an Ir Damim during the destruction itself. So you kind of have this play on words here. Who's the Damim? Is it the people who already live there, or is it the death that's coming? And again, we have this notion, right? We have in our prophecies like Kol Sason v'Kol Simcha, and here we have Kol Shot v'Kol Rash. The sound of the whip and the sound of the noise. Why? Because of the susim that are coming. The horses are coming and the chariots are coming to destroy the city. And that's essentially what we get to see here. And now we see the death in verse 3. What do we see here? Parash ma'aleh v'lahav cherev. The chariots are coming, the swords are here, and they're coming to halal. The dead bodies are piling up, the pager, the ones that have been killed. Ve'ein ketzel legvia. There's no end to the death, to the bodies that are piling up in Nineveh. So you really see how, even though we talked about destruction in chapter 2, there's really no comparison between chapter 2 and chapter 3. This escalation is quite intense when you get to chapter 3. And why is this happening? Right, we saw earlier in chapter 1, this is happening because they're wicked, the people of Nineveh. But here we get this imagery, merov zinune zona, because they're all harlots. Now, in the metaphor by us for Judea, it's because we're being harlots in the sense that we're not being faithful to Hashem, we're being faithful to other gods. Here, it's not so clear that's what the metaphor is about. It may just be that it's using it as an example of like being lowly, like people who are not doing things appropriately, they're immoral. Merov zinune zona, and essentially that's what they're doing. And they're kshafim, they're like witches, right? They're doing terrible things because their whole family is like that. Mishpechot bichshafer. Everyone in the family is doing that. So Hashem will come and destroy. Again, this is focusing on the people of Nineveh. What happens in verse 5? Hineni elayich neum Hashem tzvakot, the God of a battle. What will I do? I will reveal shulaich. I will reveal your skirts, meaning I will reveal your nakedness upon your face, and I will show the rest of the world and your shame. Umamlachot klonech. I will show all the kingdoms of the world your nakedness. So not only will I destroy you, but I will embarrass you. Right? So this escalation, and that's what we see here. And what will happen to you? You'll be thrown away like garbage. There's going to be disgusting things thrown upon you. You're going to be disgusting in the eyes of everyone, and you will be like roi, which means like feces. Everyone who sees you will know how disgusting you are. Look in verse 7. Okay, we have a weird word coming up here. Everyone who sees you will what? Yidod mimech. What does that mean? Everyone who sees you will yidod mimech. Ve'amar, and we'll go back to the word in a second. What will they say? Shadda Ninveh. They will say, what happens to Ninveh? Shadda, it's destroyed. Mi yanud la. Who will yanud? It's like who will wail over the city? Ma'ain avakesh. Who's going to search after her? That's like when we have our destruction, we say nobody's looking, nobody's seeking after us. In Eicha, menachamimach, nobody's giving nechama. The same words are used by our own destruction. What is the word yidod? Similar to what we saw before, the Navi is using a play on words in order to get a message across. Yidod is very similar to the other words that he's already using in this pasuk. What's he saying in this pasuk? Shadda yanud. Yidod. So he kind of throws in this word that is not a word that we have anywhere else. It from its context clues becomes quite apparent, right? Everyone who sees you will what from you, right? If someone's disgusting and people see you, what will they do? They'll look away. They'll turn aside. Yidod. When you hear the word yanud, which means to essentially seek after or will wail after you, it sounds like they see you and they just like they don't want anything to do with you. Get away from me is essentially what anyone sees or thinks when they lay their eyes upon you, the people of Nineveh. Verse 8, well, you're going to have to look back at the map. Let's read it inside them and look at the map because we're going to focus not on Assyria, but of a different place within the empire. Hatetvi, verse 8, Hatetvi mi no Amon, are you better than the city of no Amon? We'll get to that in a moment, which is sitting on the Yeorim mine, that is sitting among the rivers, Savivla, that are around her, Asher chel yam miyam chomota, that essentially the seas, just for the English translation, the seas are around her as a wall. Meaning, the prophet is asking the city of Nineveh in a rhetorical fashion, do you think you're better than No Amon? And what happened to No Amon? It was destroyed. Talk about that in a moment. No Amon is destroyed. And kind of what happened? Who destroyed No Amon? Cush Atzma destroyed her. Cush destroyed her. All of these people, Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Luvim, were the nations surrounding the city called No Amon. They were the ones who were supposed to defend her, and they didn't do anything. So they're essentially part of the reason that they were destroyed. So let's take a step back from what I've just described this outside. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it a little bit. No Amon. We've actually seen this place before. Does anybody remember? Not in this Sefer. We saw it earlier. So if I'm not mistaken, we saw it back in, I believe it was in Yeshayahu. So No Amon, if you look on the map, I'll show it to you. It's in your source sheet, the final page, and I'll pick it up here. No Amon, here's our map. No Amon is the city of Amun-Ra, which is an ancient Egyptian city, which you may have heard of because the name of the god was Ra. And Amun-Ra is the ancient city that later becomes known as Thebes in Greek. When the Greeks take it over, it essentially becomes Thebes, which is the modern Egyptian city of Luxor. So Thebes, I'll zoom in here, is here. It was the ancient capital of a number of dynasties, which was destroyed by whom? The Assyrians. What happens? Look at the Egyptian, note how it says this is the Egyptian kingdom before 671 BCE. Because what happens circa 671 going into the 660s? Assyria expands its orbit, defeats the Egyptian empire, and captures what's now modern day Egypt and northern Sudan. So this becomes swallowed up into the Egyptian empire, and they destroy the capital city, which is down here, right? That's down there. And essentially this ends the 25th Egyptian dynasty. So when the Navi is talking to Nineveh and says, do you think you'll fare better than the city of Nineveh? Excuse me, than the city of No Amon? You won't. You Assyrians destroyed No Amon, and now you will be destroyed, perhaps even worse than the city of No Amon. And those other nations that were mentioned, just to put in perspective, so who are these cities that were mentioned, the other nations that were mentioned in our description here? Just scroll up here. Who were those cities? Cush, Mitzrayim. So Mitzrayim is Egypt, obviously. Cush is essentially south of ancient Egypt, which is Nubia, which is kind of like Sudan. Put, it's a little bit less clear who exactly Put is, but Put seems to be also in the Sudanese region. Lubim is Libya, right? Is that region. So you have like the southern Egyptian area and the western Egyptian area. They were supposed to come to your protection, right? You, the Egyptian Empire, and everyone fell apart, and you, your city, were destroyed. So you have essentially all of North Africa in one pasuk, right here. Okay, so you, Nineveh, will be destroyed, kind of just like you destroyed the city of Noamon. Okay. Hilagola, she went out into exile. And essentially, because this is kind of what Yossi was asking about, they were brought into exile. It doesn't exactly talk about you going into exile in the same sense, but they went into exile. Again, probably the royalty and the priests, the upper echelons of society that lived in Amon-Ra, they went into exile because you destroyed them. And that's essentially what's being described here. And now you, Gamat, you too will be what? Will be tishkari, will be drunk, and you will be na'alma. You will kind of be taken away, and you will want to be ma'oz me'oyev. You will want a place to find safety from your enemies who are going to attack you. However, it's got a problem. You have no more places to hide. Hide and seek is done. Because what are your fortresses like? They're like fig trees, not a great place to defend yourself. It's like a fig tree that you shake the tree and all the fruits fall out. So if you're in a tower, and you shake the tower and everyone comes tumbling down, it's not exactly going to protect you. The last couple of verses here, with which we'll come to a close in a few minutes, essentially is describing the people of Nineveh. And this is kind of going back to the language that we've seen before, which is that if men are traditionally the fighters in society, so it's going to describe the soldiers of Nineveh as not being men, but as women, right? Which traditionally are not the fighters. So the pasuk says, "Hinei amech nashim bekirbech." The people who are essentially among you are women, le'oivayich, to the enemy, meaning the enemy is going to defeat you. Patoach niftechu sha'arei artzech. Your gates to your land are going to be wide open. There's no one to defend it, and the cities of Assyria will be destroyed. Again, the water comes back because that's clearly how they defended themselves in ancient Assyria. Mei matzor sha'avi, bring the water out for the siege, right, to defend yourselves. But it's not going to work. Meaning we're saying essentially we're telling rhetorically, defend yourselves, get the water out, build the walls. Nothing's going to work because what's going to happen at the end of the days, at the end of the destruction here, they're going to be destroyed. Sham tochlech ish. Fire will come and destroy you. Like a disease, and that's what's going to happen. And just the last couple of verses here, jump to verse 16 and 17. 16 right here, we have an interesting description here of merchants. Here, Beit Rochleich mikochvei hashamayim. Once it used to be that you, Nineveh, were a center of merchants and trade. You were the center of the world. What happened? Yelek pashat v'yaof. Then came this like worm. They're using the image of a worm because worms destroy crops, right? If you have it's kind of like locust, it comes and it eats it all up. Your city will be consumed and all of your merchants will go away. Like Arba is described here. And just come to the very end here, the last two verses. Namu ro'echa melech Ashur. Here's an official stamp, melech Ashur. Up until now, we have not seen that, right? Yizkor was talking about him, but we didn't see specifically Melech Ashur, but here we have it. And I think this actually may give us a little bit more of an understanding of who Micha was talking to. It is possible, this is just a theory, that the entire Sefer Micha could almost have been written for Melech Ashur to tell him to do tshuva, or else this will happen. Meaning, we know it's going to happen because presumably they're not going to do it. But almost like Yonah, you could imagine Micha sending this off. Right, he's telling the Jews, but it sounds like he's also speaking directly to Melech Ashur. Namu ro'echa Melech Ashur. Your shepherds are falling to the wayside, king of Assyria. Yishkenu adirecha. Your adir, your great ones are not helping you. Nafoshu amcha al harim ve'in mikabetz. Your people are running around like they're leaving the city to the mountaintops, or they're fleeing to go into the cities. Ve'in mikabetz. There's no leadership anymore. Again, because it's being destroyed. And the final verse of our parak, of our Sefer, ein keha lishivrecha. Your pain will not go away. Nachlam akatecha. Your wound is so grave. Kol shomei shim'acha. Whoever hears about what happened to Assyria, what will they do? Tak'u kaf. They will take their hands alacha over themselves. Ki almi lo avra ra'atcha tamid. Because who has this pain, this death, not afflicted? So it's interesting. Tak'u kaf. I kind of did this, right? What does it mean to be tak'u kaf when people hear the news about Assyria? So when I read this pasuk, what do you think it means when somebody hears about the destruction of Assyria and do tak'u kaf? They do this action. What does it mean? Yeah, I see Vicky's like, oh, it's like, whoa, I can't believe, yeah, oi, I can't believe it happened. So I think that's the Pshat Shel Mikra, and that is the approach of a number of Mefarshim. But what do you think Rashi says? What do you think? Obviously, he's going to say something different. What could it mean?
Clap their hands in happiness.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Henry got it exactly. Rashi, the Radak assume, no. People are going to hear about your destruction and they're going to stand up and applause because finally the enemy of mankind has been destroyed. So again, that final verse may actually, how you interpret it may depend on like who's reading it. Meaning, if Assyria hears it, so it could kind of go both ways. Maybe like people are going to hear your destruction. They're going to say, I can't believe such a great empire fell. But if you tell the Assyrians that, wow, you're going to fall and everyone's going to clap. So maybe they'll do tshuva because they realize how terrible they are. It's one option. If the Jews are hearing it, so they probably won't do the oy vavoy. They'll probably do the clapping, right? So it may have to do a little bit with who's the audience. But at the end of the day, the perek and the Sefer ends with this almost like a question. Al mi lo avra ra'atcha tamid. Because upon who have you not done terrible things to? So like everything that you've just felt was coming to you, right? It was balach. Like it was something that you were supposed to get because of the terrible things that you've done. So just in conclusion, it's unclear to us. There are different ways to approach it, who Nachum's talking to, either to the Jews, either to the Assyrians. There's some sort of progression and increase in destruction going from property, perhaps to people, speaking directly perhaps to the king and maybe even about the queen herself. And it talks about the terrible destruction they inflicted and how they will fall even worse than the Egyptians fell when they destroyed them. The question is, who is going to destroy Assyria? We know it's going to be the Babylonians, which is why next Sefer, which is Habakkuk, will describe essentially the next empire, which is the Babylonians, also known as the Kastim, and we'll talk about why. And that'll be next time. So happy to open up to questions and comments. Next week we will introduce Sefer Habakkuk and learn chapter 1. Habakkuk is only 3 chapters. It's slightly longer, a couple extra verses, but it's also a small Sefer. So we'll learn it in 2 weeks. Chapter 1 and the introduction, and then the following week we'll do chapter 2 and chapter 3. Thank you all.
Thank you.